It's not a trick question, but just think about it. Is it good news to the deaf that the blind can see? And I'm trying to trick you or anything, but I'm saying it's nice, but what would really be good news to the deaf? That the deaf can hear. And so when the word gospel is used, and that's why we look first at a papyri letter and also from an inscription, all of these words had a flavor, they had a meaning before they came into the New Testament. And I have a dear friend right now who's revising a Greek dictionary that the last revision was 1931. And I know for a fact in 1976, 4,000 articles were written just that year on this thing. So it's just this enormous task. But when we pick up a word, the same way that when we pick up a carton, there are several categories that go with that word. And like, for example, we were talking about how language has changed. Two of my classmates for 12 years in the Sayre schools were named Kay and Gay Murphy. Very few girls in the last 10 or 15 years have been named Gay. But when you pick up a word, it's like there's little compartments, little things that are there, and it will mean different things. And so in this first paragraph, and then we're going to look at an inscription very quickly, the names are given. You filled us with joy when you announced, and here's the word gospel, good news. You announced the good news of most noble Seraphim's marriage, and we would have come straight away to give him support, and on and on. But the word gospel is dear friends hearing of the engagement of their son. Well, of their friend's son. And as we read last week, they apologized. They were only going to be able to send 1,000 roses and 4,000 narcissi to the wedding, and didn't want them to think they were penny pitchers. But look at how the word gospel is used before the word is used in the New Testament. Now, if you'll turn to the back, here's an inscription. And the date of this inscription is 9 BC, and the little town where this comes from is on the west coast of Turkey. So if you're thinking 7 churches of Asia, Ephesians, Colossians, these would be areas where not long after this, into the first century, then the letters are going to be sent. And notice, and again, this is an inscription. Since Providence, okay, about a third of the way down, has set in most perfect order by giving us Augustus, and he was born Octavian until he's 18 or 19, and then gradually acquires the name Augustus, whom she filled with virtue that he might benefit mankind, sending him as a Savior. Isn't it interesting? Totally secular Roman, having nothing to do with the New Testament. This inscription is hailing the political Augustus as a Savior, and our word that we're going to have for our term for Savior in a spiritual context is here on this inscription. Both for us and for our descendants, that he might end war and arrange all things, and since he, in the term Caesar, and inherit from this Lord by his appearance, suppressing all previous benefactors and not even leaving to posterity any hope of surpassing what he has done. He's done more than anyone else before him. And since the birthday of the god, Augustus, was the beginning of the good tidings for the world that came by reason of him. And good tidings is our word, gospel. So do you kind of see the flavor of what we're talking about? Gospel in the first century wasn't primarily something that, and they didn't have leather-bound editions, it would be on scrolls, but even that, initially, gospel wasn't primarily the words about the story of Jesus. Gospel was anytime you have really, really good news. Something has happened, something's taken place. And the word euangelion starts with EU, and like you hear the word Eunice, something that's good, as in well done, good and faithful servant. And so the gospel is the story of Jesus, but before it was the story of Jesus, it was anything like an engagement, a coming wedding, like they celebrated the birth of the Emperor Augustus. And it wasn't just facts, but it was something that came across as good news. Now, I'll mention one of these, Lord willing, each night if I remember it. I listened to our missionaries who went to the upper Indians in Guatemala who didn't even know Spanish. They were way up above the Spanish culture. And when they finally were able to translate enough of Scripture into this dialect, the first thing they translated was Mark. And so as they could, then, I mean, you got to start somewhere. And if they don't have a Bible, they've never heard about these things. So they thought, okay, we're going to translate the book of Mark. And what they found out was that every time Jesus came to the account of kicking out evil spirits or casting them out, things got deathly quiet. And then as they got to know the culture, like I said, and I've heard two of these guys say this, they have seen an adult man, the witch doctor would take this kind of straw doll and jam this needle through it and curse him, and he'd be dead in 3 weeks. You know, and I've had missionaries say, we talked with them and we pleaded with them, and you don't have to be afraid of this. And this guy would be deader than a doornail in 3 weeks if he had been cursed with the voodoo thing from we would call him a witch doctor. Well, for these people who've never heard about Jesus, to have someone who comes along who can cast out evil spirits, can I do this and say that to them was gospel? That might not have been gospel to someone in Germany, but boy, to these tribal people, that was gospel. And as I told you, I don't know if it took 2 years or what, 2 to 3 years. The first girl, I can't remember, I'm going to say 14 or so, had decided to be baptized, and they waited a week or so, but they sent a messenger down the mountain and sent to churches in Texas that were supporting him and says, please pray and fast for us, because if she so much as gets a cold, we'll have to move. And at her baptism, witch doctors were up on she was baptized in a river, and they were throwing rocks down the river and calling curses down on her, and everything that you could imagine that would cause someone to be afraid in that culture. And to quote the guys that I heard, they said she just blossomed. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of going to sleep and her spirit leaving her body and someone eating her spirit while she was asleep and all these other things. And now there's hundreds of Christians in that area because it was good news that Jesus had the power to cast out evil spirits. So do you see what I'm talking about? It's not just, it is a story. I'm not saying it's not a story, but you can tell someone the story, but it doesn't necessarily mean good news until it really registers or clicks with them in some way. Some of our closest friends, you guys can, tell you what, Brad, do you mind moving? Hey, look, we're going to shift. You guys sit right here, and we can put Brad right here. Thank you. We have a couple more, but they come in a second. We put them here in these middle ones. Some of our dearest friends in the world went to Buenos Aires, and obviously they would have Spanish translations, but as they are learning Spanish and as they are teaching people, they use the Gospel of Mark. And as Steve said, Mark 16, 15, and 16 says the same thing in Spanish that it does in English. Do you know what I'm saying? And so then they could use kind of their English Bible background, but they taught people the gospel out of the book of Mark, and then they were learning Spanish at the same time as they did that. And so gospel is something that has to do with things that are good news. Okay? Now, let's do something from a letter for a second. Why did Paul write the letter 1 Corinthians?
Problems.
Pardon?
Problems.
Such as? I mean, you keep going. Problems like?
Well, so they were following different people.
Okay. So follow us. Do what? Lord's Supper. We're getting drunk at the Lord's Supper. On and on. We're having division. We're taking people to court. God's living with his father's wife. A whole bunch of things. And what I want you to think about is that here are the problems. And at certain points, Paul will go back and will take an Old Testament passage in order to say something to them about the problem that's going on. These things happened as an example for us that we might learn from them. And so in addressing the problem that the Corinthians had, then Paul's going to go back and take certain Old Testament principles and examples and use those as a part of the teaching process for the letter. I would like you to consider that a gospel does very much the same thing in that it's not just written to be a biography and a story. I think they are written to specific people. And as we're going to see, we're going to select, I think, whether it's the city of Rome or Romans, are going to be the original readers of the Gospel of Mark. So therefore, you're not going to start with, this is the beginning of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, because that doesn't make sense to them. And what I want you to notice, and if you'll do the big page first, there is either going to be a point, there's going to be a matter of concern. And see, like for example, remember at the end of John, these things are written in order that you might do what? Believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, believing you may have life in his name. Paul's going to say to Theophilus, I have written these things so you will know the certainty of the things you have been taught. And so in the same way that Paul is going to take the Old Testament to address something that's going on, I think Mark and the gospel writers, and if you look at on the right-hand side, here are all these details from the life of Jesus. There's a point or a problem, something that they're dealing with that they want to address. And the details on the right go through the audience and the point to comprise the gospel. Now, I'm going to say the same thing in a little bit different way. And probably wouldn't even use this with your grandchildren. Most of us have been into a Furr's cafeteria before they left town. And when you go to a Furr's cafeteria, the object is not to get a spoonful of everything behind the counter. Right? So here's the salads, and if you want to choose something in the salads, you choose one, maybe two. Then they normally did the meats, and you choose, okay, this sounds good today. And then here's the vegetables, and here's the dessert. And what ends up being on your tray is not just a spoonful of everything that's behind the counter, but depending upon the weather and your taste or whatever, then you select certain items that make up the meal from these different areas. And so I think of things like parables, miracles, the life story, the teaching of Jesus, and each writer, like we would have a tray in a cafeteria, is going to come along and is going to select certain things from the life of Jesus that fit in terms of helping him to make the point to the people who read the letter for the first time. Now, everybody okay with that as kind of a working example? And so, the reason we've started with Mark is that 90% of Mark is in the book of Matthew. 50% of Mark is in Luke. John doesn't really count because if you take Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, only 7% of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke is in John. 93% of John is not in any of the first three Gospels. So we kind of set it aside. In all, 94% of the book of Mark is in Matthew and Luke. But because of their audience, they're going to have Sermon on the Mount. They're going to have teaching sections. They're going to have parables that Mark doesn't have. And please take this the right way. I don't say this disrespectfully, but when I read Mark, I think this is the Reader's Digest version. Not leaving things out, but because of the audience, and I think probably Romans, it's going to be very specific, it's going to be very action-oriented, and we're going to go shoom on the way to the cross. And as we're going to see for a second, what Matthew and Luke take chapters to do in the early life, Mark does in 11 verses. And he's going to be getting us to the events leading up to the cross very quickly, because for the people that he's writing to, that's the appropriate thing to do. And so when I read a gospel, I don't think of, a history or a biography of the life of Jesus. And this is from Charlie Powell. I just marked that out. But it's a collection of the life and teachings arranged in such a way as to deal with a specific problem and to make a specific point. Now, let me go ahead and anticipate something. Clyde Entwine worked in Germany maybe for 25 years. And being Europeans and being, to their mind, more educated than most of the rest of people, and many of them are. I mean, how many of us speak 4 or 5 languages, by the time we graduate from high schools type thing? But he would say to people who've never read anything from Scripture, did you know that a doctor wrote a story of the life of Jesus? And he said over and over in German, say, a doctor? Yes, there was a doctor who wrote a story of the life of... You begin to see what's starting to happen with gospel? And so for an educated German to find out for the first time, there was a doctor who wrote a story about the life of Jesus, then that became, can I use the term good news now? That became the good news for them then to kind of start looking and finding out the events that took place actually in the story of the life of Jesus. Because until there's a connection, it's not really gospel. Now, let me just say one other thing. And I still shake my head. It's still just growing up doing VBS in church, it still just nerdy hurts my head. In 12 years in Australia, I studied with one person who had ever read their Bible before I talked with them. And I still can't even hardly comprehend that. We were read Bible stories before we could talk. Mom was reading Bible stories to us. And so in 12 years, I talked to one person who had ever read their Bible before I talked with them. And there were others, but that, in my experience, that's what happened. You can choke a baby if you give it too much meat. You can blind someone if they have too much light. You can kill a plant with too much salt. Are you hearing what I'm saying? And so, depending upon where the person is, if they have no background at all, then what I would ask them to do is that if you would read 3 chapters of the Gospel of John a day, we'll get together on Tuesday, Thursday night, whatever works, and we will kind of start working through this, but I would like for you to read 3 chapters of the Gospel of John a day. If you'll do that, I'll do this. Now, what's going to happen in a week's time? 3 times 7 is... How many chapters are in the Gospel of John? 21. They're going to read through the Gospel of John for the first time in a week. And then I promise you, if they will do that for 6 weeks to 2 months, the Word of God is what? Living, active, sharper than a 2-edged sword. And a whole group of questions will begin to develop. But we have no business talking about baptism because they don't even know who God is. But if they will read through a gospel, bites at a time, and start, can I use the term digesting, and you understand what I'm trying to say? Then I have to be careful to not give them too much too soon and choke them on too much meat. We had a student that was gone by the time you got to, we had a student named Wilson who was a special needs student when I was there. And thankfully he whistled most of the places that he went, so at night you could hear him coming. But if you two guys are dating and having a chat, if you didn't hear him coming, hi guys, how are we doing? And at night, when couples are visiting or talking or whatever, Wilson would come up and shine a flashlight in their eyes and ask them, hey guys, how are you doing? I've seen entire parts of campus move because Wilson's coming. But it never occurred to them at night, if you shine a flashlight into someone's eyes, they can't see. He was an amazing guy. We got cards from him, but my birthday is the 13th of March, and my birthday card will be mailed to Australia on the 13th of March. Our anniversary card would be mailed on the 15th of June. We hope you're enjoying the Republican and Democratic convention cards would come, and all kinds of special things, but they would take 2 or 3 weeks to get there. But because he couldn't comprehend international postage and being a special needs, but he was so faithful. He was at Alameda, and when he passed away, they did a trust fund, and people donated money, and the proceeds from the trust fund will always have cards out so people can get a card from Wilson's table, because he sent cards to everybody. But if you're in the dark and someone comes up and shines a flashlight in your eyes you can't see, I am the light of the world. And one of the most amazing things, and I didn't expect this, was that these people, as they're in the process of learning to digest gospel, learning to hear the gospel, they identified with Peter a lot more than they did with Christ. I'm using the word pagan, meaning totally in the world. If you're a pagan in the world and you start reading the gospel for the first time, Jesus is kind of so far and so high in terms of identifying. They identified it more with someone who stumbled and fell than they did with someone who was sinless initially, as they're in the process of doing that. So I'll leave you to read the things on the back. There's just some questions that you can look at. We will indirectly touch on some of those as we go through. But I want you just to think about that, is that a part of why there is a structure in each of the gospel accounts is that they are written to a different audience, and there's a different either need or problem or situation, and so the writer's going to take that into account, and he's going to go over here and say, here's the events, and like the ones that are here from the Gospel of John. And so John is going to leave out 93% of what Matthew, Mark, and Luke selected because he's writing for a different purpose, and then that purpose will determine here are the things that become a part of that item called the gospel. Jesus said, heaven and earth will pass away, but what? My words will never pass away. And I oftentimes think every minute that we spend in Scripture, but especially in the Gospels, is ours forever. As my mom and dad passed away, we had some 1960 Growler encyclopedias. Who wants to buy a set of 1960 Growler encyclopedias today? And from a human point of view, things get updated, they change, and on, but this is not going to change. And I think as we understand the process by which the original Gospels are written, let me just say it in this way. Something in Scripture should never say something to us that it never said to someone in the first century. And the better I understand what this said to people who first read it, then I'm in a better position then to say, okay, this is either what it means for us or this is how it impacts us. Sometimes we don't know a whole lot about the person writing, but you stop and think. The influences that we grew up with are going to impact us for the rest of our life. And the more we can just kind of get little glimpses, snapshot of who wrote, that will also help us with this. And I love this little description. The gospel accounts are the story of the cross with a different introduction. 30% of our gospel accounts is going to be the last week. And so they will take different paths, give different details, talk about different aspects of it. But when you look at our 4 gospel accounts, 30% of the gospel accounts is about the last week. And so depending upon the audience and where they're from and why the writer is writing this particular one, the events leading us to the cross will vary. John is his Jewish name. Mark, is probably his Roman name. And this becomes very significant because we're going to find out the influences and traditions in terms of where he is. We first come across John Mark. He's with Paul and Barnabas on a missionary journey. They're going to return from Jerusalem having taken benevolent money. They completed their service, bringing with them John, whose other name was Mark. They arrived at Salamis. They proclaimed the word of God in the synagogue, and they had John to assist them. So John's on the initial part of the missionary journey, and we're not told why. But notice 1-2, very early, he left the group and returned to Jerusalem, and I'm just looking at this from Paul's point of view, he deserted. Now, we're not told why. And they're coming into Asia Minor. There's huge mountains, a lot of passes, can be a lot of danger and travel. But for whatever reason, he returned. And then we're going to find in 13:13, Paul and his companions set sail, and he left them and returned to Jerusalem. So in a sense, the first rattle out of the box, he didn't succeed. And the first time he had to be a follower and a learner, then, like I said, for whatever reasons, he left. 1-3, Paul and Barnabas are going to break fellowship over where the Mark goes with them on the next trip. Barnabas wanted to take with him John called Mark, and there arose such a sharp disagreement that they separated from each other. And this term sharp disagreement is something that is an irritant, and one of the lexicons that I read a while back said it's like having a small rock in your shoe. At some point, it's worth the trouble to stop, undo your shoe, get the rock out of your shoe. And so here are these two guys, and the matter of taking Mark with them, I can hear Barnabas saying, yes, but he was young, and we should give him a second chance, and on and on. I can hear Paul saying, if we can't count on him, we need to leave him at home. And they split fellowship over this. So when you look at the one just above 1:1, and this is interesting to me, Barnabas was a wealthy Levite from Cyprus who had been a landowner. And you'll read the passage, he sold a piece of land, gave the money, laid it at the apostles' feet, pre-Ananias and Sapphira. But here he is from Cyprus. So they have gone to Cyprus on the first journey. Then they're going into Asia Minor. John Mark leaves. And notice what takes place, 1:4. Mark is with Paul, this is going to be later, during his house arrest in Rome. And later, some good news, in Colossians 4:10, we find Mark is the cousin of Barnabas. Doesn't that tell us something else about the disagreement? And so not only is Barnabas of the nature of being the son of encouragement, let's give him another chance, then we find out John Mark is the cousin of Barnabas, and see where those connections come together. And then Paul says to the Colossians, concerning whom you have received instructions, if he comes to you, welcome him. So somewhere there's going to be a major reconciliation by the time we get to Philemon and Colossians, and John Mark is now back in the circle. Philemon, there are greetings from Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. And then 1:5, Paul is going to urge Timothy to get John Mark and come quickly before winter to Rome. Luke alone is with us. Get Mark and bring him with you. And what does he say? He's very useful to me in ministry. Now, anticipate, there's a couple of really important things. I think this is, well, let's go ahead and keep reading. I'll ask the questions here in a second. Paul, and I call this a gospel writer seminar. When you read the book of Colossians, then we have Luke and Mark and Paul is in house arrest for 2 years in Rome. Then I think Paul gets out, is able to do some things. He's now imprisoned in 2 Timothy, and Luke is there, and he says to Timothy, before winter comes, you go and get John Mark, bring him with you. Before winter comes, my departure's at hand. I'm not going to live much longer. And I'm not being sarcastic when I ask this. What do you think Mark and Luke and Paul would be talking about during 2 years of house arrest? The chariot races? Are the greens or the reds going to win this year at the chariot races? It's amazing to me that here is a synergy, a gathering of the majority of the text and the books of our New Testament within these three people. By the time you do Luke, Acts, Mark, and Paul's letters, the majority of the New Testament is with Paul in house arrest during part of the 2 years, and then at the very end, you go get John Mark and bring him. Somewhere in this process, these guys are talking and the Spirit's moving them to start writing what we know as the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke. As well as that, Peter, and this is going to be very important, Peter has very close family ties with John Mark and his family as well. Remember, Peter's in prison, delivered by an angel, and he gets out, and where does the first place that he goes? Acts 12 and 12. He went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, and many were gathered praying. That's something very significant. Peter gets out of prison, and the first place he goes to is John Mark's mother's house. Everybody okay? And then later, as he writes 1 Peter, then Mark, my son, sends you greetings. She who is at Babylon, and a lot of people wonder if that's Rome, who is otherwise chosen, send you greetings, as does Mark, my son. And I apologize, I wasn't able to find this. I have a 50-year folder on Mark that is behind some bookshelves because we're redoing the floors. And the guys have been thoughtful enough to allow me access to my books, but I can't get to my files. And and that's okay, because I like just doing something different anyway. But when you go back and look at all of these intersections and things, like, for example, and I don't have them at the tip of my tongue, there are 10 Latin words in the Gospel of Mark that are not in the other parts of the New Testament. Mark is going to explain Jewish customs, Corban and other things, and in our newer translations there's going to be a parentheses, and whoever's going to read the Gospel of Mark is not familiar with Jewish stuff that Matthew would never have to explain, because if you start with a genealogy, you're writing to people who are submerged in Jewish culture, and you don't have to describe Corban, you don't have to describe these specific things, and that's a part of the unique flavor. I wonder, is Mark back with Peter in Rome when it's time to write the Gospel of Mark? There's some things we don't know, but those are at least intersections that are there. But here's number one, and this to me, again, is part of, I think, the background of the writing of the book of Mark. Mark writes a great deal about the challenge of following Jesus. His shorter, action-packed gospel is filled with examples of those who followed Jesus and the challenges that they faced. And this is what I think of. Who better to write about discipleship than one who has failed at the challenge of making disciples with Paul and Barnabas and quit following them? Because we're Christians, individual failures need not be final. One of my favorite chapters in the Gospel of John is after he has denied him 3 times, Jesus says, Peter, I want you to feed my sheep. I want you to feed my lambs. And even though he's denied him with a curse, he's not put on a 3-year probation before he's allowed to speak again. And sometimes, this is true of all of us, sometimes we learn, not always, but sometimes we learn, and things that we failed at one point or another, especially with the spirit of wisdom, can help us to be wiser and better the next time and not do that. And that, to me, again, is very much a part of the spirit of Barnabas, that he's willing to reach out and say, yeah, he didn't do it the first time, but let's give him a better chance. Number 2, and think about this, how might Mark have turned out if Barnabas hadn't stood up for him? Oh yeah, that's that kid who's the failure. He thought he could do this, but he just couldn't cut the mustard, and so he was a quitter. And I hope I can say something very specific to us, and you know what I'm trying to say. And it's not just new Christians. There are times that people around us in the church are going to sin, and I'm not condoning sin, not approving sin, that's not it. But what I am saying is this: sometimes the capacity to be Christ-like and reach out and embrace those people and nurture those people. And what does Paul say? If a brother is caught in a fault, ye who are spiritual, what are you to do? Restore such a one, but how are you supposed to do it? With a spirit of gentleness, that you yourself might be tempted. Restore such a one is the same word that was used of the apostles, well, they become apostles, who are mending their nets when Jesus comes along and says, come follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. You keep dropping nets into the water, all the stuff that gets caught in it, and at some point you've got to stop and you've got to mend the nets, or it's going to tear and get worse. If you're going to keep fishing with those nets, they have to be repaired. And that's the term that Paul uses, that we restore such a one with a spirit of gentleness. And I think about that a lot. Matthew, Luke, and John, Acts. What if there was no Mark? Would he have ever been the one to write the gospel if the tag, oh, the one who failed and wasn't able to do it, stuck with him, and no one came to give him another opportunity to come back? And so here's our question. How Christians, we the church, treat someone after they have spiritually failed has a lot to do with how they learn from this, or if they leave the church forever. And I've met people, talked with people who said, I'm just so embarrassed, I don't think I can ever go back. And I think every time we can embrace someone spiritually and welcome them back and give them another opportunity, very, very important thing. And so when I'm reading the Gospel of Luke and he's going to talk about follow me, follow me, follow me, ironically, who better to write about following me than someone who had failed at one point? And then as he goes to the life of Jesus, the gospel he's going to write is going to be the gospel that also had changed his life as well in the process. So on the back page, technically, who was right? Paul or Barnabas? Barnabas. And here's what's significant. After this event, Paul never did press his opinion to the point of breaking fellowship. I've been in 3, borderline 4, just good, dirty church fights that other people have been involved with. And my experience is it typically starts as a personality matter, but at a point in time, one party is going to make it a doctrinal matter to have a higher hand on the matter. And about 90% of our problems in the church start out as personality matters, and then if they fester and grow, they become, quote, a doctrinal problem. I think Paul learned from this, and you won't ever find him breaking fellowship in the future over an opinion. Now, these guys in 2 Timothy, they need to be handed over to Satan. They're living in sin, a different matter. But look, and I read 1 Corinthians 16:12, concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to visit you with the other brothers. It was not at all his will to come now, so I disfellowshipped him and will have nothing to do with him. It's not what the text says. And if you've been in the church long enough, some people press their opinion to the point of dividing fellowship, and that's something that Paul, I think, did with John Mark. But not only did he not do it again, I want you to bring Mark to me because he is useful to me, and he didn't, can I say he buried the hatchet? I'm struggling for an idiom, but he didn't let his mistake prevent what I look at as the development and the growth of John Mark. And how would you feel as John Mark, knowing that at one time Paul would not have you in his company, and then he writes, oh, I want you to bring him to me because he's useful to me in ministry. Raymond Kelsey said something once. He said, when someone writes me for a reference for a young preacher, I try to give a dog a good name. He wasn't referring to the guy as a dog, but what was he saying? I'm going to try to do everything I can to find good things for him to live up to as his potential and his possibility at every time that I get a chance. And look at how this worked with Paul. One time he wouldn't have him, and then he not only is going to embrace him, and I wonder, is actually the writing of the second gospel influenced and a part of being accepted and brought back into fellowship and learning to follow Jesus after we had failed? And look at how that experience is going to influence going back to the events of the life of Jesus and going to become a part of the writing of the gospel. So here's 4. In the same way that Barnabas, the son of encouragement, stood up and supported Paul, he's going to do the same thing for Mark. The early church is running away from Paul. I can just hear somebody saying, do not let him have the church directory. Literally. I mean, if it was today, this is the guy that kills Christians. Make sure that he does not know any more about, so he's trying to join the church and they're treating him like a spiritual leper for good reason. This is a guy that carries people off to prison and kills them. And Barnabas is the one who welcomes him and brings him back. And then if you notice, Paul doesn't spend the rest of his ministry speaking ill of Barnabas. One time he mentions a shortcoming. He was carried away as Peter was. And so here's just some things to think about. The sermon in Acts 10, and it's also going to be in chapter 13. I'm talking about Peter's sermons, are going to have a lot of parallel with things in the Gospel of Mark. And there's a whole bunch of things there that we're not going to get into. But when you read Mark, Mark has more human details and also descriptions of the failures of Peter and the apostles than any of the other Gospels. Let me say it again. Mark has more details about the shortcomings of the apostles and more of Peter's shortcomings than the other Gospels. And I wonder, being Peter's son, if he doesn't have firsthand commentary and firsthand description from Peter about those things. And if Mark is writing the gospel, would you really want people to know all the ways that you had messed up when you were an apostle? But that's just a part of the flavor. And how does Mark know about this incident? A young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. They seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. This is the only place this is mentioned in the Gospels. I wonder, how did Mark know about that? He might have been that young man. It might be someone else. We're not told. And whoever read Mark knew Rufus and Alexander. They compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country. the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Now here's my question. Why would you mention Alexander and Rufus unless the people who are reading the gospel know who they are? And when you read the letter of Romans, Paul will say, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, also his mother, who has been a mother to me as well." We have no way of knowing if this is the same one, but it's very interesting. Whatever happened to Simon of Cyrene, Alexander and Rufus probably became Christians. Looks like maybe their mom became a Christian, and what a compliment. Paul says, that woman there, she's also become a mother to me as well. Mentioned this last week. We were living in Memphis when Elvis died. I'd gone downtown, and in every corner there's somebody with newspapers, and I had no idea, just driving around. And the first newspaper said, "The king is dead." And I thought we settled that in 1776, And then the next one, they were huge letters, Elvis died or whatever. And I turned on the radio, and every radio station in Memphis had something going on about that. And, people came from hundreds of miles, on and on it went. Why didn't they use the word Presley? You didn't need to in Memphis. Everybody knew who Elvis was. Whoever read Mark for the first time knows who Alexander and Rufus are. And I wonder if these are the guys that we have Paul talking about, Rufus, in the city of Rome, and that is at least an option. Very, very early in the early church, and these are people in the 2nd century, and again, I didn't write down all the citations, but several of the early church writers are going to describe again Mark writing his gospel from the city of Rome. And remember the inscription about Augustus, the good news about the birth of Augustus? How does the Gospel of Mark start? The beginning of the glad tidings, the good news, Jesus Christ, Son of God. The other thing I've noticed just this week, remember how the Gospel of John starts? In the beginning was the Word was with God. Nearly a direct quotation from Genesis 1. I'd always thought about this is how the story begins, but Mark also uses one of Moses' words from the very beginning. The beginning, not of creation, but the beginning of the good news, the glad tidings about Jesus Christ, Son of God. And like I said, I apologize, I can't lay my fingers on these, but in the Gospel of Mark, there are 10 Latin words, some that are not found anywhere else in the New Testament. And again, why would you use Latin words if you're writing to a Jewish audience? You see what I'm saying in terms of you look at the book and you kind of weigh things up, and the things that are in the book give you some hints and details about the audience and what was written. And he explains Jewish customs that the readers of Matthew would instinctively understand. Like, for example, and again, there's several of these. Mark 7 and verse 3. Jesus is talking about eating with unclean, ceremonially unwashed hands. A newer translation is going to have parentheses, meaning like a footnote. Oh, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other customs, traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. You would need to write that to Jews. You see what I'm saying? So when you look at these details within the book, 10 Latin words, and then when we have these Jewish customs that someone, I think probably in the city of Rome, would not be familiar with, then our newer translations, does yours have like a parentheses, and it functions like a footnote does for us in our text today. And so, and again, this is just personal. If you get the chance, I just encourage you to read through the Gospel of Mark this coming week, but just imagine you were in the city of Rome. So you're not Jewish. You don't have a background of those types of things. And you're listening to glad tidings. And you probably have been taught verbally. You know probably who he is. But the readers of this book are going to be given a vivid, imaginary, picturesque, action-packed view of Jesus. And we're not going to have hardly any parables or any sermons at all, because that doesn't suit the readers of this book for where they are right now for the first time to come across the term gospel. And those parentheses are also like in 541, 734, and 1534. There's several times where Mark will just stop and give an explanation that Jews wouldn't need because they would be very, very familiar with that. So let me just do these four things, and we'll just highlight this, and we'll come back and cover some details, and then we'll stop and take a break. But we're going to look at the characteristics, and the word immediately or straightway is used 42 times. It's kind of like he's telling a story. You've had a small kid tell you a story, and he can't hardly stop and catch his breath because he's going so fast. And immediately, 42 times, straightway, immediately. And see, how different is that? Seeing the multitudes, he went up on the mountain, and he sat down, and he opened his mouth, and he taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." That's never going to happen in Mark. Mark's going to be kind of the shoom, getting you straight to the cross with action and activity. And if you look under number 1, number 3 is there are 19 miracles and 4 parables, where Matthew will have 18 parables and Luke will have 19. The pre-ministry is 11 verses. And look at the geography. Early life is 11 verses. The Galilean ministry, he's going to go to Judea. He's going to go south in the chapter, the last week, and then the resurrection. And the Son of God, I'll go down to number 5, is very, very significant, and we'll come back and look at those. I would like for you to look on the back page, 2 things, and then we'll stop and take a break. Mark uses 3s in great succession, and we'll come back and actually read this, but look under number 7. The spiritual blindness of the disciples is illustrated by Jesus healing 2 blind men. Now I've got 3 parentheses. If I could have just done one big one, I would have done that, but my font and stuff wouldn't do that. But notice in 8:22, Jesus is going to heal a blind man twice. Okay, tongue in cheek. Were the batteries low and he just didn't have the juice to do it, so he had to come back and heal him a second time? Oh, what do you see? Oh, I see people walking like they're trees. I think there's a really specific reason, because he's going to give physical sight to the blind, even if it takes the second chance, while he's talking about spiritual sight to the apostles who are spiritually blind, even though they can physically see. And it's going to take more than one attempt for them to get it and for them to have the sight. So what we'll come back and look is that it's 8:30, 9:30, and 10:30. 3 times Jesus says, guys, we're going to Jerusalem, we're going to die, this is what's going to happen. And we'll come back and fill in the blanks. Every time there's either a protest, a misunderstanding, or something else, Peter rebukes him. You can't die. I mean, I'm sorry. We were just taught you respect older people. We had all these aged relatives. I would never rebuke my grandfather. I mean, the words just couldn't come out of my mouth. Can you imagine rebuking the Son of God? Telling the guy who raises the dead and walks on water he doesn't know what he's doing. So when we come back, we'll fill in the blanks. But see the set of 3? We're going to have the blind man that's going to be healed twice. And then 3 times there are things that Jesus predicts, and they either object, they disagree. We're going to bring mom into this. And then when you get on the other side, what do we have? The healing of another blind man. And this is going to become the structure in Matthew, Mark, and Luke of the center of the Gospels. And from this point on, Peter is going to say you're the Christ. and we're going to head to the cross, but those three things are very, very significant. The other one, look down at number 8. As we get really close to the cross, and there's all this cross-examination and other things, Jesus asks some questions about, well, they ask him, what authority are you doing this? He gives the parable of the tenants. And then notice under 8:3, Pharisees, Herodians, paying taxes to Caesar. Sadducees, marriage at the resurrection. Number 3, teachers of the law, what is the greatest? And when Jesus gets through answering these, we'll look at some detail in a bit, they dare not ask him any more questions. Kind of fill in the blank? Killing. No more talk. Every time we talk to this guy, he makes us look like idiots. And by the time they have gone through this whole discussion, and then Jesus has this other question, who was the son of David, then they have made the commitment, we're not going to debate anymore, we're not going to talk anymore. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this is what precipitates the death of Jesus on the cross. In the Gospel of John, it's going to be the healing of the blind man and the raising of a 4-day-old dead man. But in the first 3, it's these couplets that are there. And so, if you'll just notice on the previous page, these are just a series of 3s. And like I said, let's take a stretch and a break. Those of you who may need to leave, God bless, because I don't want to keep you too long if you need to leave. But let's take a short break and we'll come back and walk through this. And then Charlie has done a structural analysis, and this is just typical of Charlie Powell. And we'll just end with this tonight. You can read this if you want to talk about it later. If you're not able to stay, we'll do that. But we'll do those 3 things as we finish up. So let's have a stretch break. And if you need to take off, God bless, and appreciate everybody being here. We'll pick up again in about 10 minutes, okay? I would think it probably would be Peter is the one that gave him more of the first-hand account things, because Paul's still going to be a rabbi during the life of Jesus, and that's why, to me, it's significant that the 2 major figures in the book of Acts, the first 12 chapters is Peter, then 13 on is Paul. He has contact with both of them. Paul is going to receive insights and visions, but I would anticipate in terms of details, and like, for example, Peter's sermon, like in Acts chapter 10, there are certain details of it that are nearly line for line parallel with the structure of the book of Mark. And like I said, that was tucked away and I couldn't get to that for tonight. But it's very interesting that some of Peter's sermons, the details, the approach, what he includes, then you can identify those items in Peter's sermons in Acts, and then you go through and that's exactly the same details that Mark is going to give a fuller account of in the Gospel of Mark. And again, we said this last week, none of the world religions have anything like this. We don't have 4 accounts of Muhammad. We don't have 4 accounts of Buddha. We don't have 4 accounts of Confucius. And this to me is just one of the treasures of Christianity. And like I said, I would just like to encourage you sometime through this week, just put on the blinkers. And if the time's right, you can read most of it in one setting. If you can't, do what you can. But just sit down and just kind of put yourself in the place of people who read this for the first time. And to me, there's something very, very instructive with each one of them to go back and just say, okay, rather than, and it's appropriate to go to other accounts at times, but for this, just kind of go through and look at the details that are there. Let's walk through this sheet, and like I said, we'll give a little more details and be good to just review this a little bit. But look at these characteristics, this gospel of activity. The word is, again, immediately, straightway, 42 times. Vivid details. And I didn't put down the guy I first saw this, but he said, Mark reminds me of a foreign correspondent who is reporting from the scene. Been different guys in war scenes, and if a bomb goes off behind them, they have an immediate, obviously, personal safety reaction. But it's like live account, and that's what I think of when I read Mark. It's like where it's going to, and it's just the activity and the action is going to be the focus on that. Pictorial, he describes events of action rather than speaking. And like I said, in Mark, 18 or 19 miracles. only 5 parables. 4 of them are in chapter 4, and then Jesus gives this parable toward the end. And so he's not going to focus Jesus talking about ethics and Jesus talking about the kingdom. And we said this the first night, and we'll say this in different ways. You can preach the gospel from parables. You can also preach the gospel from miracles. You can preach the gospel from sermons that Jesus gives. And you can preach the gospel from the interaction of Jesus' life. Mark is going to preach more of the gospel from miracles, percentage-wise, than the other 3. That's going to be the thing that he focuses upon the most. So, brief outline. Like I said, pre-ministry, 2 chapters in Luke, 11 verses. Well, we get right into the ministry of Jesus. The Galilean ministry of the Son of God. And like I said, focusing primarily on the miracles and the interaction. Very brief description of the final trip to Jerusalem in chapter 10. And then the rest of it is the events leading up to his death, and then the resurrection and the final commission. So geographically, and this is helpful just to kind of see where Jesus goes. Like I said, anything on the early life, 11 verses. Sure, we're there in a hurry. And then the Galilean ministry, so you're in Galilee. And then when you come to chapter 11, verse 1, he left there and went to the region of Judea, beyond the Jordan. So Luke is going to give us from 9:51 to chapter 18 for what happened with that. And Mark's just going to give the events. Jesus is going to go there. And so if here's the city of Jerusalem, and you go down the passes, and then you come to the city of Jericho and the Jordan River as it runs into the Dead Sea, then for this time, Jesus is going to be on the other side of the Jordan River on the east side. Then the last week in the resurrection. Deity is very important in Mark. And again, that's why I like this inscription talking about, in other places, Augustus. Well, he was referred to as the Son of a God. And so the deity of Jesus is very important. And we've already mentioned the beginning. Again, review. Jesus means Savior. Remember, she is told, you will call his name Jesus. He will save his people from their sins. Christ, Christos, is the Hebrew word for the Messiah or the Anointed One. So Jesus is the personal name. Christ is like the office that he has. Son of God. What a bold claim. Verse 1 and 1. And then in 11 and 1, waters of Jordan, BL is beloved, my beloved son. We'll see the other 2 references here. 9:7, beloved son. Of all things, the priest is going to holler about the Son of the Blessed. And then the centurion is going to say, surely this was the Son of God. Now, I know we've read the account, but you stop and think about it. If you are in Rome reading this for the first time, what happens to your ears when you hear the comment from the centurion? There is no better witness in the ancient world in a trial or a credibility situation than the backbone of the Roman army. And so in the Gospel of Mark, and he's in the others, but I'm just saying, thinking the audience and the people who are reading this for the first time, for someone in Rome to hear one of these hardened, very capable centurions say, surely this was the Son of God. You hear the gospel in that for those people in that particular setting. So the first half of Mark with the word Christ, here's the Anointed One. And then the second half begins with Peter's statement, you are the Christ, because he introduces that. And now see, in the other Gospels, something will be said about Son of God. Mark doesn't include that. He just says, you're the Messiah. And so from the confession in chapter 8, then through the end are going to be the details leading to that. And even the word gospel, Mark uses it 8 times, Matthew only 4, Luke uses it 2, and there's that ring of gospel all the way through. So, number 5, he's introduced as the Son of God. beloved Son twice. And this still always just interests me. Look at the evil spirits. Holy One of God, you're the Son of God, you're the Son of the Most High. And what I didn't do, both for time and other things, and this is this wonderful contrast, evil spirit, Son of God, Pharisees, who do you think you are? Who gave you this authority? Oh, he cast out demons by Beelzebub. And that contrast between the evil spirits and the religious leaders is very, very startling. And as I said, we referred to the centurion, you're the Son of God. Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. And I had a whole string of those that got deleted as I did that. I'm guessing, just having looked at it, I think there's 12, 15 references to Son of Man. Daniel in his vision in chapter 7 is going to have a vision 1 as of the Son of Man. And Ezekiel, over and over and over and again, is referred to as the Son of Man. And again, these are prophetic terms that are used. This is what I think, and you can weigh this yourself. Jesus obviously knows that the plan of God is for him to be crucified at the end of his ministry. If you run around calling yourself Son of God, they're more likely to be trying to kill you than if you call yourself the Son of Man, to give yourself time to get there. And the Son of Man is true because, being deity but born of Mary, he is physically the Son of Man. But I think the Son of Man also has the sense of the sorrow, the suffering. And when Jesus talks about who I am and what I'm doing, then others will refer to him as Son of God. He will describe himself as the Son of Man. Quickly look at the sets of 3, and I'm sure there's others. There are 3 boat scenes where Jesus is in the disciples in the boat. And there's calamity that happens in virtually each one of them. Jesus is going to predict his coming death in Jerusalem, and we'll look at these when we turn over the page. His opponents ask him 3 final, I call them trick questions, trying to trap him. On the Mount of Olives, 3 times he calls his disciples to alertness. 3 times he finds them sleeping in Gethsemane. Peter denies him 3 times. There are 3 crosses, Jesus and the 2 thieves that are there. There are 3 3-hour intervals, and again, doing it from a sundial. When you hear the 3rd hour, think 9 o'clock. When you hear the 6th hour, think noon. And when you hear the 9th hour, think 3 o'clock. So there's these 3 3-hour intervals. And so they're at Pilate's door, beating on the door, probably close to sunup. And they have him on the cross by 9 o'clock. Darkness comes over the face of the land by noon. And then he's going to actually die then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But there's 3 different intervals given while he's on the cross. And you just shudder. The Son of God dies in the midst of 3 hours of darkness, which is so wrong, such a tragedy. Now, when you look at the back, we touched on these, the spiritual blindness. And I'd like for somebody just go ahead and turn to 8:31, someone turn to 9:30, someone else turn to 10:30, because they're very short. But because we're right in the middle of the book, the way I remember this is that, get home in the evening, it's kind of late, hopefully had supper, things wind down, 8:30, 9:30, some people are in bed at 10:30, others aren't. But it's those kind of 3 late hour nights. And 3 times Jesus is going to announce, this is what I'm going to do. So that's the prediction. And then I want us to notice each time the apostles have a response. And it may be a little more than one of these. But somebody read 8:31 and 32.
He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and by the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him.
Okay, look at their response. Jesus is very specific. This is what's going to happen. This is the eternal plan of God. And like I said, Peter takes him aside and just straightens him out. When I think of rebuke, I think shaking a finger at somebody. And look at the response. There's also going to be the confession, you are the Christ. But let's go on to the next prediction. 9:30, 32.
They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know. For he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand the saying, and were afraid to ask him.
Okay, see again? Very clear, black and white. Jesus saying this is what's going to happen. Every time they miss the point totally in one way or another. Chapter 10, 32 through 34.
And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed. And those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, see, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes. They will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise.
Okay, and then what happens next? That one's a little longer. Read just a little bit further.
And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us what we ask of you.
Stop just a second. We got two parents here. If any one of the three kids come up and say, I want you to say yes before I tell you what I'm asking, what's going to happen? But you see, this is what they're doing to Jesus. Master, we want you, before we tell you what we want done, we want you to agree to do this. No parent with kids would ever do this. That's how desperate they are to sit on the right and the left hand and to be the greatest. And then what happens?
And they said to him, grant us to sit one at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory. Jesus said to them, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?
Okay. And what I want you to see, three very clear predictions. Every time there's a total misunderstanding. And this is very much at the center of Mark. And it's going to be in Matthew and Luke. But it's the showpiece right in the center of Mark. And I just made this comment. And then he heals blind Bartimaeus in chapter 10. So on both sides of these three predictions, and these three where they totally don't get it, are the healing of blind people. Which then invites you to ask, who's really blind? Jesus is going to give physical sight to those who can't see, and yet he's also trying to spiritually instruct the spiritually blind who can physically see. And that's a beautiful part of that middle part of this. The final conflict, what authority? And then the parable of the tenants where they kill the son. And after that, they look for a way to arrest him, the 8:2, 8:3. And we won't stop and read these. But again, notice, Pharisees and Herodians, they have the first go, paying taxes to Caesar. Sadducees, I'm sorry, if I'm husband number 5, 6, I would ask for a food test or something. If there's been 5 guys that have bit the dust, if I'm number 6, I mean, it's hypothetical, okay? And they're trying to trap him, but just, I grew up and 2 sisters learned to cook, and thankfully Sheila was a superb cook, but we were just taught in my house, if you say you don't like it, you get to eat 2 helpings of it. And so everything that was served, sweetheart, that was just wonderful.
The fact that the Pharisees and the Herodians got together was surprising because they hated each other.
They're at odds, political, spiritual, politics makes strange bedfellows, and here they are. What they have in common is their opposition to Jesus. When we first got married, we lived in the married student housing, and my brother Kent came for, 3 or 4 meals. if you know my brother, every time he left, he would say, Sheila, that was some kind of meal.
Non-committal.
That's all he would say. He'd say, Sheila, that was some kind of meal. And she'd say, what on earth does that mean? I says, I'm not a mind reader. I don't know. So the fourth time he came, Sheila served him broccoli, and he said, what is that? And she said, it's broccoli. He said, who? She said, it's broccoli. He said, oh, I never have eaten that. And then when he left, he said, that's some kind of meal, and he left, and she said, I've served you broccoli 6 times, and you haven't said anything. And I said, and I'm not going to. If you serve it, it's going to be good. But how crazy. Married 7 times, who is going to be her husband in the resurrection? And they don't even believe in the resurrection. And again, the bringing together the first 2, the Sadducees asking a question about something that's against their whole religious belief, and then the teacher of the law, what's the greatest commandment? The Pharisees had counted 613 commandments in the Old Testament. So when you read this, he's got 612 chances to be wrong. And that's why they're trying to trap him with that.
They're asking his opinion.
Yeah.
Isn't that 613 ways to be wrong? Do they have an answer before he gives them the answer?
I would assume in that there would have been a consensus, because there's a lot said in the Mishnah about different rabbis that had said different things, and so that's probably what they were looking for. But he didn't have to. He'd already thought that one through. He didn't have to pause, and then he goes ahead and says, "Okay, this is the second greatest from there." Then I love this one. Who's the son of David? Who's the Christ? And again, talking about sitting on the throne, prophecy of David, speaking about Jesus. The large crowds listen to him with delight. They love him putting these religious people in their place. But by the time this is through, no more questions. And this is why Judas then becomes so important. And as we mentioned in the previous class, the nearest identification to Iscariot is probably in Judea. If that's true, there's a possibility that Judas may have been the only non-Galilean among the 12. And what did the little girl say to Peter? You're one of them. Your accent gives you away. Judas may have had connections in Judea that when it comes time to betray Jesus, he would have access to be able to do that. And that was, again, his free will to do that. But the large crowds listened to him with delight. Mark's view of the cross is one of suffering and in pain. And in the fall, Lord willing, we'll look at this. Let me just do it in a couple of sentences. Mark, my God, why have you forsaken me? Matthew says the same thing, but Matthew gives us more details on one side of the cross of the plotting and the planning and the scheming to get Jesus on the cross, and then on the other side, the fulfillment of Scripture. Both of those just have why have you forsaken me, but Matthew then gives us the plot on both sides. Luke, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Little Jewish boys, like we know, Father, lay me down to sleep, pray the Lord my soul to keep. Little Jewish boys were taught, as you put your head on the pillow tonight, say, Father, while I'm sleeping tonight, into your hands I commit my spirit. Trust. Luke. John, tetelestai, it is finished. And so, same way, each one of them are going to give us a very distinctive view. Mark focuses just primarily on the agony and the suffering that's a part of that. Mark reports several women bringing spices to the tomb. And this whole term, come follow me. And when I read Mark, I think of being down at the coast, wherever it is. You know, the tide comes in, the tide goes out. And disciples will come to Jesus, he will send them out, they'll come back in, and there's this kind of this back and forth that goes all the way through, but the call is discipleship. Open-ended question. Anyone has a thought? In what ways are we like the disciples in Mark when it comes to the challenge of deny yourself, Take up your cross and follow me. Think of any parallels with us 2,000 years later?
We're still baptized the same way they were,
Good?
and we still worship according to the way the early church did.
Mm-hmm.
So all the discussion about how to live a Christian life points to the fact that you deny yourself, things you've been doing, and you repent and turn away from those things. That's still it's a burden for you to do that, because you're used to doing these things a certain way, and when you realize or you learn that this is not the way God or Christ wants you to live, I guess you couldn't say it's necessarily a cross, but it's a burden of some kind, to be able to keep yourself away from those things.
Exactly.
It made me think of Tim's sermon when he was talking about the blind man, about how it was blurry,
Mm-hmm.
or blind and blurry, and then you could see
Yeah.
clearly. Some of us are, all of us have those kind of moments.
Exactly. And the healing from the blind to the blurry to be able to see is kind of an ongoing process. And see, like, for example, her name was Wendy, commercial artist, very, very, very talented. She was baptized, had never heard a cappella singing until she came to Church of Christ. And the first night, her neck just popped up because she'd heard organs and everything else, never heard that. She made a fabulous living as a illustrator, whatever, artist, on doing wine labels. About 6 months after she became a Christian, she said, "Can we talk?" And I said, "Sure, we can talk." And she said, "I never had thought about this until now that I've become a Christian, but do you really think God wants," and she said, "I'll make a really, really good living at this, but do you think God really wants me to be promoting the liquor industry as a Christian?" Okay, I didn't bring that up. I didn't force that onto her, but she came to the point of saying, and within a year she had transferred out. She has never made the money the same level that she's made since then, but that was a very personal decision that she made, and it comes to us in different ways, but at different times there's a need to deny. And then I think of the cross in terms of putting something to death in order to follow Jesus. Can I use the word paradigm? The paradigm that the disciples are called to. They don't always get it right. They struggle with it. But that's also the paradigm that continues on today. So, discipleship. Thanks, guys. Have a good evening. What comes to mind with discipleship? What are things we can learn about being, if I say better followers, you know what I'm trying to say?
I just think about that good soil, you have to get those roots down in there.
Okay. And in the good soil, the roots had to grow down in order, there's no fruit without roots. And it's one thing to follow our own desires, our own will. It's another thing to do everything we can to follow His will. There's kind of this gradual exchange for, and even in the garden, what's the comment? "Lord, not my will, but your will be done." And then to me, one of the great ironies that, and this comes over a period of time, some forms of life only appear after there's been a death. And I'm thinking of a kernel. Remember, unless the kernel of the wheat falls into the ground and dies to being in a shell and in a kernel, then you're not going to have the roots and you're not going to have the plant until the original seed.
Yeah. I think it's unattainable to have an expectation of yourself too early. And so you do have to grow.
Yeah.
But we want to be the disciple that's in here that we're reading about.
Yeah.
But we can't yet because we don't know how.
Yeah. And as I said earlier, a group like this, anytime we find someone who has tripped up, who has fallen, and again, I'm back with the Galatians passage, those of you who are spiritual, it's really important that people get a sense, and I use the term acceptance. I'm not talking about accepting sin, but I'm talking about accepting people who either may be embarrassed or who are struggling or whatever else in order to be able to come back. And historically, and again, particularly people who don't have a Christian family, I found out, usually within the first 6 months of becoming a new Christian, Satan's going to bring some new temptation into their life to see if he can pull them back into the darkness. And then oftentimes by the 3rd year, it's like there's these little pop quizzes, but then these major exams come along, and it really helps if we're next to people to be able to try to encourage them and to strengthen them, and maybe to say, you know, I understand, or I feel, or God forgives you. And we don't want to be Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. That's not what I'm talking about. But you know what I'm saying. There's going to be times when new Christians and even older Christians are going to struggle, and having someone to be able to come in and welcome them and encourage them is really, really strong. Now, we're not going to look at this in detail. I'll just make a couple of comments and we're finished. The oldest manuscripts end with Mark 16 and 8. And if you turn to that, most of your translations, newer ones, will have like a dash or a line, and we'll just say the newer, older translations end there. Do you end the gospel with, they went out, they had doubts, and they told no one anything? Just seems like a strange way to end something. It is in other ones, and all I would say is that there's nothing given from chapter 16 verse 9 to the end that's not in the others. But here's what to me is very interesting, and I had this written down and it didn't get in this particular list. When we meet John the Baptist is preaching. Where is he at? The wilderness. And what happens to the people who he's preaching to? They're baptized. Jesus starts being baptized. He's in the wilderness, and he comes out preaching. So our first two people we're introduced to, preaching and baptizing, are the main things of the life of John in his ministry and the life of Jesus. Go into all the world and do what? Preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. And what I find interesting is that the very same thing that John and Jesus are doing, that's how the longer ending of Mark is. And like I said, there's nothing in there that is only there, that's not referred to in any other form at all. Greg, verse 19, what does very next to the last verse, what does verse 19 say?
So then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat at the right hand of God.
Okay. The beginning of the gospel, and then is there verse 20?
And they went out and preached everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by accompanying signs.
I just find this really interesting. Verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In one sense, the gospel story in detail, death, burial, resurrection, right hand of God, doesn't really happen until the last two verses of Mark. Understand what I said by way of connection? He introduces and says, this is the beginning of the gospel, but the gospel story really doesn't begin totally until Jesus has died, he's resurrected, he then goes back to the right hand of the Father, and then the gospel starts in the second generation and is spread to others. But there's a sense that when I read through Mark, I oftentimes close it and think, the beginning of the gospel didn't happen until the last two verses of the book. Very good. Thank you for your time. God bless. And like I said, if you get an opportunity, just read through Mark, think about yourself as the original audience, And Lord willing, we'll look at Matthew, and it'll be a totally different structure when we come to that next week, Lord willing.